let's begin by clearing something up, because if we don't get this right, everything else falls apart. Narcissism is not about sexual orientation. It is not about who someone is attracted to. It is not about masculinity, femininity, or identity in that sense. Narcissism is about ego defense. It is about psychological survival strategies that were built early in life to protect a fragile, wounded sense of self. When we talk about narcissistic men, we're not talking about men who secretly desire something different. We're talking about men who desperately need validation to hold themselves together. That's a very different conversation. At the core of narcissism is insecurity, not the everyday insecurity most of us feel from time to time. I mean, a deep, almost unbearable sense of not being enough. But here's the twist: that insecurity is so threatening to the narcissistic person that they cannot consciously tolerate it. So instead of feeling it, they build a defense system around it. And that defense system is grandiosity, entitlement, arrogance, charm, control. Think of it like armor. If someone feels small inside, they build something massive outside. A narcissistic man may appear confident, dominant, even magnetic. He may command a room. He may project certainty. But psychologically, that confidence is not solid. It's scaffolding. It's constructed. It has to be constantly reinforced by external applause, compliments, admiration, attention, power. Without that reinforcement, the whole structure trembles. That's why validation becomes oxygen. It's not optional for him. It's necessary. When people admire him, he feels temporarily stable. When they question him, criticize him, or withdraw attention, it feels annihilating. Not mildly uncomfortable, annihilating. And this is where people often get confused. They see the self-focus, the obsession with appearance, the preoccupation with status, and they try to interpret it through the wrong lens. But narcissism isn't about desire. It's about defense. It's about protecting a fragile ego from collapsing. Healthy confidence doesn't require constant proof. Healthy self-esteem can tolerate mistakes. It can tolerate disagreement. It can tolerate not being the center of attention. Narcissistic confidence cannot. So what does that mean in relationships? It means when you're dealing with a narcissistic man, you're not dealing with someone who is securely grounded in who he is. You're dealing with someone who needs you to help regulate his self-worth. Your admiration becomes part of his psychological stabilization system. Your praise becomes glue. Your silence becomes threat. And here's where it becomes exhausting for partners. You're not just in a relationship. You're in a regulation system. If you stop validating, he destabilizes. If you assert yourself, he feels criticized. If you shine too brightly, he feels diminished. And because his ego structure is fragile, he responds defensively. With anger, withdrawal, blame, shifting, or devaluation, this is not about attraction. This is not about orientation. This is about ego survival. Many narcissistic men learned early in life that vulnerability was unsafe. Maybe emotions were mocked. Maybe love was conditional. Maybe achievement was the only thing that earned approval. So they adapted. They created a version of themselves that would never again feel small, unseen, or powerless. But here's the tragedy. The defense that protected them in childhood becomes the barrier that prevents intimacy in adulthood, because real intimacy requires something terrifying for them: emotional exposure. It requires admitting uncertainty. It requires allowing someone else to matter without controlling them. It requires risking rejection. And if your entire personality is organized around never feeling inadequate again, intimacy becomes dangerous. So instead of connection, you get performance. Instead of partnership, you get power dynamics. Instead of mutual vulnerability, you get impression management. And if you're sitting there wondering, why does it always feel like he needs to win? Why does he need to be admired? Why can't he just be emotionally present? This is why his nervous system equates vulnerability with collapse. That doesn't excuse the behavior. It explains it. Understanding this changes how you interpret what's happening. You stop taking it personally. You stop believing you are failing. You stop trying to love someone into security. Because here's the truth. No amount of reassurance from you can fix a wound he refuses to face. Narcissism is not about who someone loves. It's about how they protect themselves from feeling unlovable. And until that fragile core is addressed, not covered, not defended, not performed over, real intimacy will always feel like a threat. At its heart, narcissism isn't pride. It's protection. Now, once we understand that narcissism is fundamentally about ego defense, the next piece starts to make painful sense. Because if someone is organized around protecting a fragile self, then what they end up loving isn't a person. It's an image. And this is where so many partners get confused. You meet him, and in the beginning, it feels intoxicating. He's polished. He's confident. He seems to know exactly who he is. He talks about his achievements, his ambitions, his lifestyle. He curates himself carefully. The way he dresses, the way he speaks, the way he posts, the way he's perceived, it can feel impressive, magnetic even. But what you're actually witnessing isn't self-love. It's image management. A narcissistic man doesn't love himself in the way a healthy person does. Healthy self-regard is quiet. It doesn't need an audience. It allows room for imperfection. What he loves is the reflection, the constructed version of himself that earns admiration. He falls in love with how he looks through other people's eyes. That's a very important distinction. When he achieves something, it's not just about accomplishment. It's about being seen achieving. When he buys something, it's not just about enjoyment. It's about status. When he tells a story, it's often edited to maximize impact. There's a performance quality to it. And here's where this begins to affect you. If someone is in love with their own reflection, then the people around them become mirrors. Your role becomes very subtle, but very powerful. You reflect back to him who he wants to believe he is. When you admire him, you polish the mirror. When you question him, the mirror cracks. And because the image is everything, any crack feels intolerable. You might notice how sensitive he is to criticism. Even gentle feedback can provoke defensiveness or rage. That's not because the issue itself is catastrophic. It's because it threatens the image. It interrupts the fantasy of superiority or control. Over time, you may start to feel like you're competing with something you can't see. And in many ways, you're competing with his idealized version of himself. This is why relationships with narcissistic men often feel one-sided. It can feel like there's no real space for you, your needs, your fears, your complexities, because complexity disrupts the image. Real intimacy requires imperfection, and imperfection destabilizes the illusion. So instead of two whole people meeting, you get one person performing and the other person accommodating. In the early stages, this image can be intoxicating. He may present as the perfect partner, attentive, charming, larger than life. But even that charm is often strategic. It secures admiration. It locks in supply. It ensures the reflection stays flattering, and once the relationship stabilizes, the performance shifts. Because now he assumes the mirror is secure. This is when many partners begin to feel unseen. The attentiveness fades. The curiosity fades. The empathy feels shallow or conditional. You may notice that conversations drift back to him. His problems feel urgent. Yours feel minimized. It's not that he doesn't hear you. It's that your experience doesn't reinforce the image. And here's the painful part. When the image is threatened, By your independence, your success, your boundaries, he may respond with devaluation, subtle digs, comparison, withdrawal. Because if you shine too brightly, the mirror no longer centers him. Narcissistic love is often admiration based, not intimacy based. He may say he loves you, and in his way, he might believe that. But what he often loves is how you make him feel about himself. When you affirm him, support him, elevate him, he feels powerful. When you assert yourself or require reciprocity, he may feel diminished. And because the internal self is fragile, preserving the external image becomes the priority. You may find yourself working harder, praising more, criticizing less, shrinking parts of yourself, all to keep the peace. Without realizing it, you've been recruited into maintaining a persona. This is why partners often describe feeling lonely in these relationships. You can be sitting right next to him and still feel invisible because the connection is filtered through image maintenance. And the tragedy is this, the more he invests in the reflection, the further he moves from authentic connection. Real love requires seeing and being seen. It requires letting someone witness your fears, your uncertainty, your flaws, and trusting that you won't collapse under that exposure. But if your entire personality is built around never appearing flawed, then love becomes conditional, controlled, curated, and you cannot compete with a fantasy. Understanding this shifts something important inside you. You stop asking, why am I not enough? You start realizing this was never about me because you were never meant to replace the image. You were meant to reinforce it. And until someone is willing to step away from the mirror, to tolerate imperfection, to dismantle the performance, to face the fragile core underneath, they will keep loving the reflection more than the relationship. And no relationship can survive when one partner is devoted to the mirror instead of the person standing beside them. And once you understand that the image is everything, that the reflection must stay polished, then the next piece becomes almost inevitable. Because real intimacy, the kind that actually sustains a relationship, requires something that directly threatens that image. It requires vulnerability. And for a narcissistic man, vulnerability does not feel romantic. It does not feel bonding. It feels dangerous. Let's slow that down. When most people think about intimacy, they think about closeness, shared experiences, maybe physical affection. But psychological intimacy is much deeper than that. It's the willingness to say, I'm scared. I don't know. I messed up. I need you. It's the ability to let someone see the parts of you that aren't impressive. For someone whose entire identity is organized around never appearing weak, that kind of exposure feels like standing on the edge of a cliff. Remember, at the core of narcissism is a fragile sense of self. Underneath the grandiosity, there is often shame. Underneath the entitlement, there is fear of inadequacy. And vulnerability risks touching that shame directly. So instead of leaning into closeness, he defends against it. You might notice this in subtle ways at first. When conversations get emotionally deep, he changes the subject. When you share something painful, he intellectualizes it instead of empathizing. When you ask how he feels, he gives you facts instead of emotions. It's not that he has no feelings. It's that accessing them feels unsafe. Intimacy requires mutuality. It requires allowing the other person to influence you, to matter, to affect you. And for someone, who equates emotional exposure with loss of control, that influence can feel destabilizing. So what does he do instead? He may create intensity without intimacy. Big gestures, passionate beginnings, dramatic declarations. These can feel like closeness. But intensity is not the same as vulnerability. Intensity can still be controlled. Vulnerability cannot. Over time, partners often describe hitting an invisible wall. You try to go deeper. You try to talk about fears, about the future, about emotional needs. And suddenly he withdraws, or he gets irritated, or he accuses you of being too sensitive or too dramatic or creating problems. This is not random. This is defense. Because the moment the relationship asks him to drop the performance, to admit confusion, insecurity, or emotional dependency, his nervous system registers threat. And here's something that's incredibly important. Intimacy requires accountability. When you truly connect with someone, you have to be willing to acknowledge when you hurt them. You have to tolerate guilt. You have to repair. For a narcissistic man, admitting fault can feel like ego collapse. If the self is already fragile, then accepting responsibility doesn't feel like growth. It feels like confirmation of inadequacy. So instead of repair, you get deflection. Instead of, I'm sorry, you get, you're overreacting. Instead of reflection, you get blame. Instead of closeness, you get distance. And that distance can be deeply confusing. Because on the surface, everything might look intact. He may still show up. He may still provide. He may still engage socially. But emotionally, there is a guardedness, a ceiling, a limit to how deep things are allowed to go. You may find yourself doing most of the emotional labor, initiating conversations, expressing feelings, trying to problem solve. And after a while, it becomes exhausting because intimacy cannot be carried by one person. True closeness requires reciprocity. And here's the painful paradox. The very thing that could help stabilize his inner world, authentic connection, is the thing he fears the most. Because intimacy asks him to step out from behind the armor. It asks him to risk being seen without the curated image, without the grandiosity, without the control. And if his early experiences taught him that exposure leads to humiliation, rejection, shame, then his avoidance makes psychological sense. Again, it does not excuse the harm, but it explains the pattern. You cannot build emotional safety with someone who experiences emotional exposure as danger. That's why so many partners feel lonely even while committed. You're reaching for depth and he's reaching for stability. You're asking for connection and he's guarding against collapse. And until he is willing to confront that underlying shame, to sit with it instead of outrunning it, intimacy will always feel like a threat rather than a gift. Real love requires the courage to be imperfect in front of someone. And if imperfection feels unbearable, closeness will always feel unsafe. And when intimacy feels threatening, when vulnerability feels unsafe, something else quietly takes its place, objectification. Because if you cannot risk seeing another person in their full humanity, with their needs, their complexity, their power to affect you, the safest way to relate to them is to reduce them. Not consciously, not always cruelly at first, but functionally. In relationships with narcissistic men, partners often begin to notice a subtle shift. In the beginning, there may be admiration, you feel chosen, desired, put on a pedestal, but a pedestal is not the same as respect. A pedestal is a display stand, and displays exist to enhance the image. Remember what we talked about earlier? The reflection, the mirror. If someone is in love with their own image, then the people around them become props that help maintain that image. A successful partner boosts status. An attractive partner enhances appearance. A devoted partner stabilizes ego. You are no longer just a person. You become an extension, and extensions are not treated as equals. They are managed. This can show up in ways that are incredibly subtle. He may brag about you publicly, your accomplishments, your looks, your loyalty, but privately dismiss your emotional needs. He may want you present at events because you look good together, but show little interest in your internal world. You begin to feel like you are valued more for what you represent than for who you are. Objectification doesn't always look like overt disrespect. Sometimes it looks like conditional appreciation. As long as you support him, admire him, reflect him positively, you are cherished. The moment you ask, rat a boundary, express anger, or stop serving the image, the warmth shifts. That shift can feel shocking because when someone relates to you as an object rather than a whole person, your autonomy becomes inconvenient. Your independence becomes threatening. Your emotions become disruptive. Objects don't have needs. Objects don't challenge. Objects don't leave. So when you act like a full human being with limits, with opinions, with your own identity, it can trigger irritation or even hostility. This is why partners often describe feeling controlled, what you wear, who you talk to, how you speak, what you post. These aren't always about jealousy in the traditional sense. They're about image management. If you are part of the reflection, then you must align with the reflection. And here's the deeper psychological layer. Objectification is safer than intimacy. If he sees you as a whole person, then you have the power to hurt him, to reject him, to expose him, to see through him. But if you are reduced to a function, admiration, sex, status, support, then the relationship feels more controllable. Control feels safer than connection. Over time, this dynamic erodes something fundamental. You may start to feel invisible or interchangeable or easily replaceable. Because if you are serving a role rather than being known as a person, then the role can be filled by someone else. And that realization is devastating. You may notice how quickly affection can be withdrawn when you stop fulfilling the function, how quickly praise turns to criticism, how easily warmth turns to indifference. That volatility is not random. It reflects the conditional nature of the attachment. When admiration flows, you are idealized. When admiration stops, you are devalued. That cycle, idealize, devalue, sometimes discard, is rooted in objectification because it's very hard to devalue someone you truly see in their humanity. It's much easier to devalue an object that is no longer serving its purpose. And yet, here's the heartbreaking irony. Many partners stay because they remember the pedestal phase. They remember feeling special, chosen, elevated. But being placed on a pedestal is not the same as being loved. It is being positioned. Real love requires recognizing the other person's separateness, their autonomy, their interior life. It requires respecting their right to exist outside of you. Objectification collapses that separateness. It turns partnership into utility. If you've ever felt like you're auditioning in your own relationship, trying to stay desirable, agreeable, impressive, that's often a sign you're being valued for function rather than self. And no one can thrive when they are reduced to a role. You deserve to be seen, not used. To be known, not displayed. To be respected, not managed. Because the moment you are treated as an extension rather than an equal, the relationship stops being love and starts being possession. And love cannot grow where humanity is reduced to utility. And once a relationship shifts from connection to utility, from intimacy to image, another pattern almost always emerges. Competition replaces connection. Now, think about that for a moment. In a healthy relationship, your partner's success feels like shared success. Their joy expands you. Their growth inspires you. There's room for both people to shine. There's room for collaboration. But in a narcissistic dynamic, the emotional math is different. If his identity depends on being superior, admired, or dominant, then equality can feel threatening. In G, and your strength, your intelligence, your confidence, your achievements may not feel like something to celebrate. It may feel like something to manage. Because if you rise, where does that leave him? This is not always obvious at first. Early on, he may praise your accomplishments. He may appear proud, but watch closely. Is the pride consistent, or does it shift when attention lingers on you a little too long? Does he subtly interrupt when you're telling us a story? Does he redirect the conversation back to himself? Does he minimize your achievement by comparing it to something bigger he has done? These aren't random personality quirks. They reflect a competitive framework. In a competitive framework, there is always a winner and a loser. And for someone organized around ego defense, losing, even symbolically, feels intolerable. So the relationship becomes a hierarchy rather than a partnership. You may notice power struggles over small things. Who is right? Who decides? Whose schedule matters more? Whose stress is more important? Even emotional pain can become competitive. If you're exhausted, he's more exhausted. If you're hurt, he's more hurt. Your vulnerability does not evoke care. It triggers comparison. And over time, this dynamic erodes safety. Because when your partner is competing with you, you can't fully relax. You can't fully celebrate yourself. You may start shrinking, downplaying your success, softening your voice, avoiding attention, just to prevent friction. That shrinking can happen so gradually you don't even notice it. You might think it's easier this way. Or, I don't want to upset him. But what you're really doing is accommodating an ego that experiences equality as threat. Competition also shows up in control. Decisions become battlegrounds. Compromise feels like defeat. Even generosity can carry an edge. Gifts given in ways that create indebtedness. Support offered in ways that reinforce superiority. Because the underlying need is not closeness, it's dominance. And dominance is incompatible with intimacy. Intimacy requires mutual influence. It requires saying, "You matter as much as I do." It requires tolerating moments where you are not the center, where you are not the most admired, where you are not the most powerful. But if your internal world is fragile, you may interpret your partner's autonomy as erosion of your own significance. This is why some narcissistic men struggle deeply when their partner becomes more independent. Maybe you start a new job. Maybe you develop new friendships. Maybe you grow more confident. Instead of feeling secure, he may become irritable, critical, or withdrawn because your growth disrupts the hierarchy. And here's something particularly painful. Sometimes the competition is invisible to you at first. You think you're collaborating. You think you're building together. But underneath, he's keeping score. Who earns more? Who gets more praise? Who holds more influence? Who needs whom more? And if the scoreboard doesn't favor him, tension builds. Partners often describe feeling like they are walking on eggshells around their own success. Imagine that having to dim your light in order to preserve the relationship. That's not love. That's containment. When connection is replaced with competition, empathy suffers. Because empathy requires stepping out of yourself and into the other person's experience. Competition keeps you locked inside your own position. And eventually, the relationship begins to feel like a silent contest rather than a safe space. You may start to ask yourself, why does it always feel like a power struggle? That's not accidental. When someone's self-worth depends on being above, partnership feels destabilizing. Healthy love is collaborative. It says, we both win. Narcissistic competition says, I win or I feel diminished. And no relationship can thrive when one person's security depends on staying one step ahead, because love is not a ladder to climb over someone else. It is a bridge built at the same height. And if someone must stand above you to feel whole, they will never truly stand beside you. And when a relationship becomes a hierarchy, when connection turns into competition, something else quietly fades into the background. Emotional availability. Now, this one can be very confusing because emotional unavailability doesn't always look like absence. He may be physically present. He may show up to events. He may text you. He may even say all the right words at times. On the surface, it can look like participation, but emotional presence is different from physical proximity. Emotional availability means I can sit with your feelings without becoming defensive. It means I can tolerate your sadness without minimizing it. It means I can hear that I hurt you and not collapse into shame or explode into anger. It means I can be curious about your inner world, not just react to how it affects mine. In narcissistic dynamics, this kind of emotional steadiness is often limited. Remember, vulnerability feels threatening. Accountability feels destabilizing. Equality feels risky. So when you bring emotions into the room, especially painful ones, it can feel overwhelming to him. You might notice this in small moments. You're upset about something that happened at work, and instead of empathy, you get solutions or distraction or irritation. You say, "That really hurt me." And instead of reflection, you get defensiveness. "I didn't mean it that way." "You're too sensitive. Why are you making this a big deal?" The emotional spotlight shifts away from your experience and back onto his discomfort. That's emotional unavailability. It's not always coldness. Sometimes it's impatience. Sometimes it's intellectualizing. Sometimes it's joking at the wrong moment. But the common thread is this: your emotional reality does not feel safely held. And over time, you learn something. You learn that bringing your full emotional self into the relationship creates friction. So you start editing yourself, you cry alone, you process with friends, you lower your expectations. You become emotionally self-sufficient in a relationship that was supposed to be reciprocal. Now let's talk about empathy, because this is central. Emotional availability requires empathy, the ability to genuinely imagine and care about what someone else is feeling. Narcissistic traits often involve limited empathy, particularly when someone else's emotions conflict with their own needs or self-image. If your sadness implies he failed, he may reject it. If your anger suggests he was wrong, he may attack it. If your fear requires reassurance, he may dismiss it. Not because he consciously wants to harm you, but because your emotion triggers his defense system. And here's the deeper issue: emotional availability requires self-awareness. It requires being able to say, "I'm feeling threatened right now," or "I'm feeling ashamed," instead of projecting that discomfort outward. But if someone has built their identity around never appearing flawed, self-awareness can feel like exposure. So instead of reflection, you get reaction. Instead of repair, you get retreat. You may notice a pattern where serious conversations feel impossible. Either they escalate quickly into arguments, or they shut down completely. There's no middle ground of calm exploration, and that leaves you feeling alone. One of the most painful things partners say is, "I feel lonely even when I'm with him." That loneliness comes from the absence of emotional reciprocity. You can share space without sharing vulnerability. Healthy relationships allow both people to fall apart sometimes, to say, "I'm not okay," to admit confusion, insecurity, fear. But if only one person is allowed that emotional range, the dynamic becomes imbalanced. You may start carrying both emotional loads, yours and the relationships. And here's the exhaustion that sets in. You begin anticipating his reactions. You phrase things carefully. You soften criticism. You avoid certain topics altogether. That constant monitoring is draining because you are trying to maintain emotional stability for two people. Emotional availability is not about grand romantic gestures. It's about consistency. It's about being able to sit in discomfort without turning it into a power struggle. It's about making space for someone else's internal world. When that space doesn't exist, the relationship may look intact from the outside, but inside it feels hollow. You deserve a partner who can stay in the room emotionally, who can hear you without competing, defending, or withdrawing, who can tolerate imperfection in you and in themselves, because without emotional availability, there is no true intimacy. There is only proximity. And proximity without presence is just another form of distance. And when emotional availability is limited, when intimacy feels unsafe, when competition replaces connection, something else steps in to stabilize the entire structure. Validation. For many narcissistic men, validation is not just pleasant. It is regulating. It soothes anxiety. It reinforces identity. It temporarily quiets that fragile core we talked about earlier. Admiration becomes psychological fuel. Now, all human beings enjoy validation. We are wired for social feedback. It feels good to be appreciated. But in healthy individuals, validation is a supplement, not a lifeline. They can still feel steady without constant applause. In narcissistic dynamics, it's different. Without external affirmation, the self starts to wobble. You may notice how quickly his mood shifts depending on how he is being perceived. A compliment can light him up. Attention from others can energize him. Praise at work can make him expansive and generous. But criticism, indifference, being overlooked, those experiences can trigger outsized reactions, irritability, withdrawal, contempt, or sudden coldness. It's because validation isn't just affirmation, it's stabilization. If his identity is built around being admired, respected, or envied, then every interaction becomes a subtle scan. Am I winning? Am I impressive? Am I still superior? And if the answer feels uncertain, anxiety rises. This is why some narcissistic men appear almost addicted to attention. Social media engagement, flirtation, public recognition, constant talk about achievements. It's not always about vanity in the shallow sense. It's about maintaining equilibrium. You may find yourself becoming the primary source of that regulation. Your praise matters, your approval matters. Your admiration becomes part of his emotional oxygen supply. At first, this can feel flattering. He seems to value your opinion. He lights up when you support him. But over time, the pressure builds. Because what happens when you're tired? When you're upset? When you don't feel like clapping? If validation drops, even temporarily, he may react as though something far more serious has happened. You might hear things like, "You don't appreciate me," or "You've changed," or "No one supports me the way they used to." The subtext is clear. The fuel supply feels threatened. And here's where it becomes emotionally exhausting. You may begin managing his self-esteem without realizing it, offering reassurance preemptively, avoiding honest feedback, overpraising small things to prevent defensiveness. You become a regulator instead of a partner. Now let's talk about what happens when validation comes from outside the relationship. Attention from other women, praise from colleagues, admiration from friends. These can create visible shifts. He may become more animated, more confident, more engaged. And if that external validation feels more abundant than what he perceives at home, he may start chasing it because it's not about connection, it's about supply. This is why some narcissistic men struggle with boundaries. Flirtation can feel irresistible, not necessarily because of attraction, but because of affirmation. Being desired reinforces the image. Being admired reinforces the persona. It fills the tank. And when the tank runs low, the behavior intensifies. Now, here's the difficult truth. You cannot permanently fill someone else's internal emptiness. No amount of reassurance can stabilize a self that refuses to develop from within. Healthy self-worth grows from self-reflection, accountability, and integration of both strengths and flaws. Narcissistic self-worth often depends on maintaining a polished exterior. So the cycle continues: seek validation, feel temporarily stable, encounter criticism or indifference, feel destabilized, seek more validation. Partners often feel like they're on a treadmill, constantly running just to keep things emotionally neutral. And the moment you stop running, the instability becomes visible. If you've ever felt like love in your relationship is conditional on how much you admire, affirm, or accommodate, that's a sign validation has become transactional. Real intimacy allows for fluctuation. There are days when you're glowing and days when you're struggling, but the bond remains steady. In narcissistic dynamics, the bond often feels contingent on supply. And here's what I want you to understand deeply. It is not your job to regulate someone else's ego at the expense of your authenticity. You are not responsible for propping up an identity that collapses without applause. Validation should be shared, not siphoned. Appreciation should flow both ways. Support should not require self-erasure, because the moment love becomes fuel for someone else's fragile identity, it stops being connection and starts being consumption, and you were never meant to be someone else's oxygen supply. And when you step back and look at all of it, the image management, the fear of intimacy, the competition, the objectification, the emotional unavailability, the relentless need for validation, it all points to one central issue: identity fragility. At the very core of narcissistic patterns is a shaky sense of self, not a self that is confidently flawed, not a self that can say, I'm good at this, I struggle with that, but a self that feels unstable unless constantly reinforced. That's why everything feels so intense. That's why minor criticism can spark major reactions. That's why your independence can feel threatening. That's why vulnerability feels like danger. If your internal foundation is solid, you don't need to dominate to feel secure. You don't need to win every argument. You don't need constant praise to feel real. You can tolerate being human. But when the internal foundation is fragile, every external interrogation becomes a referendum on your worth. Did they admire me? Did they respect me? Did they challenge me? Did they ignore me? Each moment either strengthens or destabilizes the identity. And this is why relationships with narcissistic men can feel so unpredictable. It's not because there's no pattern. It's because the pattern is driven by internal instability. When the ego feels reinforced, things may feel smooth. When it feels threatened, defenses activate. You may experience sudden mood shifts that seem disproportionate to the situation. A casual comment turns into an argument. A small boundary triggers cold withdrawal. A success of yours results in subtle undermining. It can feel confusing, even disorienting, because you're responding to the situation, but he's reacting to what the situation represents. If your identity feels fragile, then disagreement feels like disrespect. Accountability feels like humiliation. Equality feels like demotion. So the defenses come out: grandiosity, blame, gaslighting, minimization, control. All of it is designed to stabilize a self that doesn't feel steady from within. Now, here's the part that's difficult but important to identity fragility. Tie is not something you can fix from the outside. You can reassure, you can accommodate, you can shrink, you can overfunction, but none of that builds a stable internal self for another person. Real stability requires self-reflection. It requires confronting shame instead of covering it. It requires tolerating imperfection without collapsing into self-hatred. It requires integrating strengths and weaknesses into one cohesive identity. And that work cannot be outsourced. This is why partners often burn out. You may start believing that if you just love better, explain better, support better, stay calmer, give more, things will stabilize. But if the instability is structural, not situational, your effort cannot reinforce a foundation that was never built. And I want to be very clear here. Understanding identity fragility is not about excusing harm. It is about clarifying it. When you see the fragility at the core, you stop personalizing every reaction. You stop believing that every outburst means you failed. You stop internalizing the message that you are too much, not enough, too sensitive, too demanding. You begin to see that you were interacting with someone whose sense of self was always on shaky ground. And when a self is shaky, it grabs, it controls, it competes. It consumes validation. It resists intimacy. It reduces others to extensions. Because anything that threatens the illusion of solidity feels catastrophic. But here's the truth that changes everything. You are not responsible for holding up someone else's identity. You are responsible for protecting your own. A healthy relationship requires two relatively stable selves coming together, not one person anchoring and the other constantly recalibrating. If you find yourself constantly adjusting, constantly soothing, constantly proving, constantly minimizing yourself to maintain peace, that is a signal, not that you are failing, but that the structure itself is unstable and stability cannot be borrowed. It has to be built. When someone is unwilling to examine their fragility, the cycle will continue. Different partners, same patterns, different arguments, same defenses, because until the core is strengthened, the armor stays on, and intimacy cannot grow through armor. So as you reflect on your own experience, want you to ask yourself one question: am I shrinking to stabilize someone else's shaky sense of self? Because love should feel grounding, not like you're constantly bracing for collapse. And no relationship can stand firm when one identity depends on keeping the other small.